Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, ones who have gone on before us, let us throw off every weight and every sin that so easily entangles us, trips us up, and run the race with endurance that is set out before us, fixing our eyes, keeping our eyes on the author and the finisher of our faith, Jesus Christ, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and is seated at the right hand, the throne of God. So we're looking at people who have died, who have gone on before us, and in a sense cheer us on in the race we're to run. Well, November 1st, 1934. For a young man growing up on a farm in the Great Depression, life was seriously difficult. As a teenager, this guy reluctantly, he attended Bible study and church and stuff with his parents, but he didn't like it. He was bored. He thought it was not for him. In fact, if anything, it left him somewhat resentful and unsatisfied. It just didn't do it for him. His father, however, was a man of prayer and prayed muchly. He prayed with a group of men each week, and they were praying in the field behind his place. And his father remembers one man praying that God would raise somebody up from their very own city that would bring the gospel to the ends of the world. You probably guessed by now I'm talking about Billy Graham. And he said about that time in 1934, it was definitely not obvious that he, in fact, would be that man. He said that there was a man, a Dr. Mordecai Ham, who came and preached revival meetings in his city. And he had no interest in going. He could care less about this. He didn't want to go. And for a month, he just held out. He didn't go at all. And then there was something that piqued his interest. There was some high school students that Dr. Mordecai Ham had called out in a newspaper saying they were practicing immoral things at a house across from the school. And the students responded by saying they were going to come, they were going to protest. They were going to protest at the platform. And so Dr. Mordecai Ham, being a fighter, this kind of piqued Billy Graham's interest because he thought there could be a fight. I think I might go. At the same time, his friend invited him to go. He said, why don't you come down and listen to this preacher, this fighter preacher of ours? He wasn't too interested, but the guy sweetened the deal by saying, hey, tell you what, you can drive my truck. You can drive my vegetable truck. We'll just pick up a bunch of people on the way. And that got him in. That hooked him. He wanted to drive the truck. And so they loaded the truck up with as many of the people that his friend invited, black and white people, and he drove the truck. In a weird way, he was an Uber driver, maybe the first, an Uber driver to his own salvation. Graham said he had no recollection of what Dr. Mordecai Ham preached that night, and for several nights he didn't really know what he was saying, but he was gripped somehow by another voice, perhaps the voice of the Holy Spirit, that convicted his heart. His heart was getting heavy and with his own sin. And Mordecai Ham, he preached on sin, he preached on money, he preached on hell. Billy Graham said, I ain't never heard anybody speak on hell before. But he also preached about the love of God. And this time, he said, I became deeply convicted about my sinfulness and my rebellion, and I was confused. And he said at the same time, he didn't like meeting the eyes of the preacher. And so him and his friend Grady Wilson, they would figure out what they could do to avoid the eyes of the preacher. And what they did, they joined the choir. So they were in the choir singing behind the preacher so he didn't have to see their eyes. But he said all during this time, these words were reaching him deep in his soul. And, he remembered one particular sermon one time that was about the love of God from the book of Romans 5:8, where it talks about while we're still sinners, God demonstrated his love for us, and he died for us. And Billy Graham never forgot that. In fact, in all the millions of people that he had led to Christ through crusades and sermons and face-to-face contacts, he would often use that verse and quote that man and quote the Bible that said, "For the love of God is demonstrated." Wow. Billy Graham, he led millions of people to Christ all over the world. He died in 2018, not too long ago, at the age of 100. At the age of 100. And, when he gets to heaven, maybe he's going to meet literally millions of people who come up to him personally and tell him, "Thank you. Thank you for preaching the gospel to me. I was one who was saved." Now, what about him? Who's he going to thank in heaven? Would he thank his father and his mother for praying for him, or his father for maybe teaching him the ways of God early on, even though he was reluctant and didn't really want to listen? Would he thank maybe his friend who invited him and offered him to drive the vegetable truck? I mean, he might also thank Dr. Mordecai Ham, who preached the gospel and a message with conviction. In the end, there are countless heroes of the faith, people whose one decision had a domino effect into the generations. I mean, all of us can think back and peel back the layers and go, who led me to Christ? And who led that person to Christ? Well, what about that person? Who led that person to Christ? And so on and so on and so on. Who planted? Who watered? In the end, God is the one who gives the growth. Jesus is the true hero, the only one we can really thank. He's the one that we turn to, the true hero of the story. All we got to do is we got to keep doing our part. Our part. Maybe it's watering. Maybe it's sowing, planting. Maybe it's shedding a little fertilizer in a good way. Let's just do our part.